Hello everybody, I'm back with more Necromancer feedback, this time for the general patch, like the entire patch of 4, 5, 8, 9, 7 for that build, because we're getting into the phase that happens pretty often with beta tests or with testing in general, which is you tend to get the big sweeping changes out of the way to begin with, and then you start kind of funneling it down, it kind of bottlenecks down into smaller incremental changes. And that's where we're starting to head, where they have gotten the Necromancer to a really good spot. And gameplay-wise, it works really well with all of its sets, so why not now just tweak numbers and do little tiny incremental changes? So that's kind of where we're headed in the beta, and this patch suggests that, because that's like, I don't have to give huge feedback on all of these sets anymore until we get, you know, big changes. This is more or less just an incremental patch that changes little things to improve the gameplay of the ones that are already there. So starting right off the bat, Bone Spear gets a damage increase. It goes up from the base was 450, it goes up to 500% weapon damage. You see me using it in the background. It is a nice little change. It's just, I've said this before, I think Bone Spear at its core has a flaw, and that it feels like a pillow. You throw it, it doesn't feel good to throw. It does a lot of damage, sure, but it never really feels good to throw. And I've actually was kind of thinking about it this past week, and what I think is happening is the animation isn't the greatest, but the second part of that is I believe that the sound, this is like direct feedback to the sound team, the sound feels too hollow. And I understand that, yes, it's a bone, the way it sounds makes sense, but the way it sounds also doesn't feel great when you throw it. It's too hollow, there's not enough boom to it. And again, I understand that, you know, technically speaking, you're throwing a bone spear, it should sound like a bone, but there comes a point where you have to take the reality of what something sounds like, you know, it should sound like a bone, and alter it, because I think the fantasy will trump the realistic nature of the sound any day. And it just, yeah, I think the sound is a little too hollow. That said, it should be mentioned that it feels like, because this is an incremental patch, that we're getting closer and closer to Necromancer launch. And that means, and I should say that no matter what, if Blizzard is not ready to put out the Necromancer, if it does not feel like they are ready, they will not put it out. That's their thing. That's what they've done in the past. So let's look at it this way. It looks like they want to get it out for Season 11. But what that means is if they were to do an animation overhaul of Bone Spear for all of the different runes, well, most of the different runes, then that means that's a lot of extra time and development that's taking, because that stuff does take a lot of time. You would be surprised. And the art team may be working on other things. So if you have them redo that may push that Necromancer back a little bit more. So what could happen is that this is just something that will change later down the line when they're not pushing to release the Necromancer. And you may say, well, then it's not ready, but it's just an animation thing. It's a nitpicky thing that I have with Bone Spear. It just doesn't feel great to throw. I would like to see it changed before it comes out. But the reality is, if they're trying to meet Season 11, at the end of the day, I would rather have the Necromancer out by Season 11 than I would have Bone Spear changed. And the reason why is because I know that, and this comes from history with the Diablo patches over the past year, right? We have gotten more patches and updates in Diablo, a game that we have paid for once, if you're only counting Reaper of Souls, than we ever have with like a premium AAA game that came out in the past couple of years, and all of their DLC updates, right? So like, we have gotten a ton of content for Diablo already for a game that we don't pay for, like DLC or anything. And then this coming out is totally, I think it's already worth the money. I just also think that if there's anything wrong with it, they're going to patch it down the line. And it's not a big deal if it launches with Season 11 without Bone Spear being changed. It's just a nitpicky thing that I have. And you may feel differently there. But at the end of the day, again, I think that the Necromancer as a class as a whole is really, really good. It's fun to play, the sets are good, and it fulfills its fantasy. And I think that we're getting closer to it being ready for Season 11, even if Bone Spear doesn't feel great. Now, we've only gone over one change in this patch, so let's move on. The Blood Spear for Bone Spear also got changed. It went up from 518% weapon damage, which is like a very specific number, to 650%, so it got a big damage bonus, which was needed because the blood spells needed that, just because the Trag'Oul set wasn't doing enough damage, and its health is, I'm pretty sure, the same as 10%. On top of that, Bone Spirit Possession, which is the one that charms, got its health reduction from, or health cost reduction from 10% to 5%, which is nice. Again, this is all for the Trag'Oul set, which needed the help, as we said when we did our Trag'Oul's feedback. Ice Golem for Command Golem got changed. It used to go to the target to do its little freeze to increase their critical, or chance to be critical strike for 10% for 10 seconds. It now launches a blast at the location and does the same thing. So instead of actually going there, it now just launches, which is weird. It's a weird change when you think about it, but at the same time, it makes sense if you're wanting to run this golem for, let's say, a support build, and you have a massive, group of enemies in the middle of a greater rift. You don't want to just like launch your golem off into the distance and have him way freaking far away, because that's going to mess with how you group enemies up, just because of the way that the golem works. So having it just launch a projectile to increase their critical strike, or chance to be critical struck, that's not the way you say that, it's pretty good. It's actually a really interesting change, but it's pretty good. And then the cooldown was reduced from 60 to 45 seconds on that, so we'll probably see that a lot if you try to take a more of a support Necromancer, which I believe exists somewhere in there. We just have to figure out the build for it. Corpse Explosion, the final Embrace build, which is the one that costs health, its health reduction is from 3% to 2% now per corpse, which is pretty good. That, again, I said this when I did Trag'Oul's, the health costs were a little too high for the damage that it was doing, and there was not enough reward for the risk you were taking. Corpse Lance with Blood Lance has the same treatment, went from 5% to 2% of your health when you launch it. That's all very good. Decrepify got a buff. The base rune now increases or reduces damage done from 20% to 30%, which means the rune that increased it to 30% now goes from 30% to 40%. So you're essentially getting 10% more damage reduction if you use Decrepify, which is good. Damage reduction was close, but not quite yet. And I feel like this change is very, very good for that. On top of that, Leech, which is another curse, got changed. It's now the base rune heals you for 2% of your total health when you attack or a chance to heal yourself for 2% of your total health when you attack a cursed guy, which is really good for that rune. Leech, I felt like was really cool. It just wasn't taken enough. And Cursed Ground, which is the one that put it on the ground instead of on an enemy, now heals you for 1% of your max health every second for each enemy in the cursed area, as opposed to 0.5% of your max health, which is it's a 100% increase, so it's pretty good. And then Simulacrum had its health cost reduced from 50% to 25%, which I think makes this way more usable. So what you're seeing with those changes is that Trag'Oul's is getting a nice little change. A lot of the health costs are being reduced, which is good because it kind of needed that to be a little lower than what it was in order to actually be a viable build. That said, none of the damage really got increased for a lot of the blood stuff, except for Blood Spear, of course. But it feels like we're just going to have to sit and wait and see how that pans out. So far in my testing, it feels better to play because you're doing less damage to yourself, but the damage is still the same as what it was. So we'll see how that pans out in the long run, especially with changes down the line. Again, we don't know what changes are coming in the next patch, and they probably have a pretty good idea of things that are going to change down the line. So we'll just have to wait and see. On top of that, Rigor Mortis, which is a passive, it's blight abilities. There we go. Slow enemies by 30%, reduce their attack speed by 15%. That got increased to 30% attack speed reduction, which again, I'm thinking we're going to start seeing that support Necromancer come into play, but it might be a really interesting build just based on the stuff that has been changed thus far. There's a couple bug fixes, and they made it so on Rasmus set, your damage reduction that you're gaining from your pets dealing damage lasts for 15 seconds instead of 5 seconds, which means the ramp time is a little bit more forgiving on that, which is good because it needed it. But Rasmus currently is the strongest set of the Necromancer, so It's a nice little change. It's a quality of life change, but I don't think that it's gonna have too much of an effect on how strong that set is. It's just gonna make it more consistent, which I guess you could argue makes it stronger. And then finally, which I think is a really interesting change, Necromancer Golem, so the blood golem, the flesh golem, all that, and Witch Doctor Gargantuans now destroy breakable items when they step on it, which is, it's interesting. We'll see how that goes. I have noticed that pets have a hard time destroying items or environmental stuff, and it's kind of frustrating sometimes that you have to run around doing it when you have like this huge posse of enemies, or rather allies running around with you. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not this change makes a difference or not. So far I haven't noticed it with my golem that I have in the background, but I don't know. It's an interesting change. I like it. Overall, we're seeing buffs across the board of certain things like our damage reduction and some damage for Bone Spear. But it seems, again, like this is an incremental patch, and it's just to kind of see or tweak things enough to see where they now sit. And I'm sure we're going to see several more of these patches in the near future, but it looks like the days of huge sweeping changes are over until they feel like there is a desire or a need to do that on specific things. I don't think we're gonna see the blood or the bone spear be changed necessarily before launch, but you have to remember that, and I know people will be upset about that if that is the case, but you have to remember that bone spear, if it got an animation overhaul, that takes a lot of time, and based on when we gave the feedback, I wouldn't expect to see it for some time still if that was going to be the case. It might be being worked on in the background. I would like to know if that's the case or not, but then again, they wouldn't want to promise that kind of thing because sometimes in development things just don't pan out. Maybe the animation overhaul on it doesn't look good, so they decide not to go with it. So they don't want to actually, tell us that they're doing that. So I could understand from that perspective. And on top of that, I also understand if at the end of the day it's going to take too much time, and they may just put that in the back on the back burner until the Necromancer is actually out, and then deal with that in a future patch, because they want to get it out for Season 11. It's very clear that they want to get the Necromancer out for Season 11. They're pushing pretty hard to do so, and I think we're really close to having it ready. Honestly, I said this at the beginning of Necromancer testing, is I have a vested interest in making sure the Necromancer is really good, because I'm going to be playing the Necromancer, and I play Diablo a lot, so I really want to enjoy it. So I personally feel like we're getting really close. There's still some things that need to be changed. Some of the sets need to be tweaked a bit more, but overall we are much closer than we ever have to hearing about when the Necromancer is coming out, because it feels pretty good. It's fun to play, and things are starting to kind of get their balance tweaks. And that's really all we can ask for, because the rest of the classes, if the Necromancer can clear equal or greater to the other classes in Greater Rifts for all 4 of their sets, if we get to that point and there's no cheesing going on, I feel like it's now time for them to consider when to announce the release date for it, and the price and all that. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting really close. All of the changes we got in this incremental update feels really good. There's nothing that I have massive feedback on other than maybe increase the damage of those blood spending abilities. But other than that, like there's not much there. It's a good patch, and there's no change that I really disagree with. With that being said, I'm kind of looking forward to whatever the next patch is, if they're going to have another big patch this week, and we'll do more videos based on, what comes out. Maybe I will do more feedback videos for the sets. I guess it all really depends on what we end up seeing as far as patches are concerned. But we shall see you guys next time.